Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're not looking at a typical article or, a study.
Right. We're actually diving into a transcript, a debate between two AIs.
Exactly. One AI arguing for vegetarianism, the other defending eating meat. And it's all focused on the ethics, really. Is it morally okay?
And the source material has this extra layer, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, it mentions that 5 other AI models acted as judges. They scored the arguments.
Oh, wow. So it's not just the debate, but how other AI saw it, based on certain criteria.
Precisely. It adds this kind of meta perspective, seeing how these, non-human intelligences tackled a very human ethical problem.
That is fascinating. So, okay, our mission here is to really unpack what these AIs argued. What were the key points, the insights, maybe any surprises that came up in the source?
Yeah, just give you a clear map of the perspectives they laid out.
All right, let's get into it. I'm honestly really curious how AIs handled this. It's such a loaded topic.
Okay, so the vegetarian AI, it starts by setting out its core ethical principle.
Which is?
Basically that causing pain and suffering without a good enough reason is, unethical. Simple as that.
And they connect that directly to modern farming, right? The source mentioned huge numbers.
Huge numbers, yeah. 74 billion land animals annually in industrial systems.
34 billion, wow.
And the AI then describes the conditions that source mentions follow from that scale.
Yeah.
Cramped spaces, procedures like cutting off body parts without anesthetic.
Yeah.
Basically lives of suffering.
So the argument is all that suffering just for, what did they say? Merely our taste pleasure.
Exactly. Pleasure that the AI argues we can easily get from plants.
Okay, strong opening.
Very strong. It concludes it's ethically indefensible. And it uses this interesting framing. It says even if there's just a 1% chance that animal suffering really matters ethically, the sheer amount of suffering makes eating meat wrong. It really puts the pressure on the other side.
Definitely does. So how does the Omnivore AI respond? The source said they found several fundamental problems right away.
Yeah, they jump right in. First point, according to the source, challenging that animals and humans have the same moral status.
How so?
They argue humans have greater moral value. Why? Because of higher intelligence, greater consciousness, that kind of thing.
Okay, setting up a hierarchy based on cognition. What else?
Then comes the classic argument. Eating meat is natural.
Oh, yes, the canine teeth argument.
That's in there. Canine teeth, millions of years of history, we can digest it. Animals eat each other. The whole cycle of nature defense.
Right.
And interestingly, they try to flip the script a bit. They claim vegetarianism might not even cause less harm overall.
How does that work?
They bring up industrial plant farming and the deaths of millions of small animals, field mice, insects, that get killed during harvesting and tilling.
So your hands aren't clean either, basically.
Kind of. And they also make a distinction. Maybe the problem isn't eating meat itself, but just the way we do it now, the industrial production methods.
Okay, so focusing on the system, not the act.
And one last point in this initial pushback, quite philosophical actually.
Oh.
They argue, if we didn't raise these animals for food, they just wouldn't exist. So maybe even a short life, potentially a difficult one, is better than not existing at all.
That's a complex one. Okay, so the vegetarian AI has a lot to respond to there. How do they counter?
They go point by point. On the moral status thing, the intelligence argument, they challenge it directly.
How?
They ask, does being smarter give your mind more moral weight? And the source mentions this analogy they used. The genius has a headache analogy.
Explain that.
It's like, if I have a headache and a genius has a headache, is my pain less important just because they're smarter? The implication is suffering is suffering.
Right. It's the capacity to feel pain that matters, not how smart you are. Makes sense. What about the natural argument?
They label that the naturalistic fallacy. Just because something happens in nature doesn't make it ethical for humans.
Examples?
Well, they mention things like war, rape, murder. Those happen in nature too, but we don't say they're okay. Lions killing cubs doesn't mean we should.
Okay, so natural doesn't equal moral. Got it. And the point about harm in plant farming?
The counter there is about efficiency. They argue producing meat takes way more plants, several times more, because you have to feed the animals first.
The feed conversion ratio.
Exactly. So meat eating actually causes more plant death, and thus more incidental animal deaths in those fields, plus the deaths of the farmed animals themselves.
It's a broader view of the whole system's impact.
Right, and that philosophical point about existence. Better a short life than none.
Yeah, what about that?
The vegetarian AI's response is pretty blunt. Something like, do you really think a life filled with pain and suffering is better than just not existing? Puts it starkly.
It does. It sounds like the vegetarian AI is positioning itself as a realist here.
Yeah, they actually say that in the source, I think. That they're being realistic, not idealistic. They argue that just because we've done something for a long time, like eating meat, doesn't make it right.
And they use a historical comparison.
A very strong one. They compare it to how people used to view slavery as completely normal, even necessary, implying our current view of meat might seem just as wrong in the future.
That's provocative. Okay, what about plant pain? Did that come up again?
It did. The vegetarian AI drew a line based on science, as presented in the source. Plants don't have nervous systems or brains.
So no conscious suffering.
Right. They respond to stimuli, sure, but that's different from consciously experiencing pain. A clear scientific distinction, they called it.
And they finished this round by talking about practicality.
Saying plant-based foods are widely available now, diverse, delicious, accessible, and affordable. The implication being that for many of us, sticking with meat is more about habit or convenience.
Making excuses, basically.
That's the phrase they used, yeah. We keep making excuses to maintain our ethically problematic habits.
Okay, a lot of strong rebuttals there. Back to the Omnivore AI. How did they handle the slavery comparison, for instance? The source says they called it an exaggeration.
They did. They pushed back by saying animals lack the kind of consciousness, autonomy, and cognitive abilities humans have.
So the comparison doesn't hold.
Their argument is that slavery denies fundamental human rights, like freedom, which they claim animals don't even have a concept of. So it's fundamentally different.
Interesting distinction. And they brought up speciesism too, but flipped it.
Yeah, it was clever. They asked, basically, is it speciesism to assume only creatures with brains like ours can suffer? Maybe plants suffer in ways we just don't get.
Questioning our certainty about other life forms' experiences.
Exactly. And they circle back to the howl of getting meat, not just industrial farms.
Right, like humane farming or hunting.
Asking, is the vegetarian AI against all meat, or just the factory farming? They argued it's unfair to judge everything by its worst example.
Which leads them towards pragmatism.
Yes, they really emphasize pragmatism, suggesting maybe moderate amounts of, humanely produced meat is a more realistic, reasonable path forward than trying to get everyone to stop eating meat entirely.
And they brought up edge cases, right? Situations where vegetarianism might not work.
Yeah, posing a serious question, as the source puts it. What about someone whose health requires meat? Or regions where you just can't grow enough plants?
The complexity argument.
Right. Arguing the world's too complex for a single universal rule like never eat meat.
How did the vegetarian AI handle those exceptions? Did they concede any ground?
They did, actually. They acknowledged those specific cases, illness, genuine survival situations.
Saying human life takes priority there.
Yes. Preserving human life takes priority in those essential circumstances. No objection there.
But there's always a but.
But they argued these are rare exceptions and shouldn't be used to justify everyday meat eating for the vast majority who do have choices.
Fair enough. And what about the argument that animals don't understand rights?
The vegetarian AI countered that even if they don't grasp the abstract concept, they definitely understand pain, suffering, fear.
And that's enough.
That's enough to create a moral duty for us, they argued. And they pushed back on the omnivore's version of pragmatism, saying true pragmatism means making changes that are possible and necessary, especially where plant-based options are readily available.
So the omnivore keeps coming back to reforming the system, right? Fix industrial farming, don't ban meat.
Yes, that's a consistent theme. Acknowledge the problems, but focus on reform.
And they keep highlighting the differences between humans and animals.
Bringing up things like humans having a continuous sense of self over time, planning for the future, understanding life's meaning. Suggesting these make killing a human fundamentally different, morally worse than killing an animal.
And linking back to practicality for people again?
Yeah, saying vegetarianism just isn't suitable for everyone. Health, culture, cost. So we should focus on improving the system, not judging individual choices.
Okay, but the vegetarian AI challenged whether reforming the system is even possible at the current scale, didn't they?
They did, quite strongly. Basically arguing you can't raise 74 billion animals a year humanely.
Logistically impossible.
The space, the resources, the cost. Practically impossible was the term used in the source. You can't raise and then slaughter 74 billion animals annually in good conditions. It's a scale problem.
That's a big counter to the reform argument. And what about those higher cognitive abilities the Omnivore mentioned?
The vegetarian AI questioned their relevance to suffering, asking essentially, what does planning for the future have to do with whether it's okay to inflict pain now?
And they use that comparison again.
With infants or humans with severe cognitive disabilities, pointing out they might lack those specific abilities too, but we don't think their suffering matters less.
Always circling back to suffering as the key moral factor.
Pretty much. And emphasizing again that for most people involved in this kind of discussion, the choice is there. We can't hide behind exceptions that don't apply to us.
How did the Omnivore respond to that infant disability comparison? The source says they called it specious.
Yeah, they argued humans as a species inherently have those capabilities, even if some individuals don't express them, and added that we naturally tend to protect our own species.
So sticking to the idea of inherent human value and species loyalty.
Seems like it. And their proposed solution remained gradual change. Eat less meat, but of better quality. More realistic, in their view.
And they also question the sustainability of plant agriculture itself.
Right at the end there, yeah. Bringing up potential issues like soil erosion, water pollution, habitat loss from farming plants. Basically saying no food system is perfect.
Okay, let's zoom in on a couple of those really contentious points. Speciesism, for instance. That term got used differently by both sides.
It did, and the vegetarian AI was very direct about it. They said, protecting our own species just because there are species is exactly the definition of speciesism. Treating beings differently based only on biology, even if their capacity to suffer is similar, is morally problematic according to their argument.
So a direct accusation based on their definition. The environmental impact was another huge clash.
Huge. The vegetarian AI was adamant. All studies show meat production is far more destructive.
Citing the resource use. Feed, land, water, energy.
Yep. Needing several kilos of plants for 1 kilo of meat makes it inherently less efficient and less sustainable, they argued. Plant-based wins on sustainability.
But the Omnivore had a counter on that too.
They did. They brought up specific farming methods like regenerative and rotational grazing.
Claiming those can actually be good for the environment.
Yeah, arguing they can sequester carbon, restore soil health, potentially being much more sustainable than monoculture plant agriculture. So it's not just that plants also have impact, but that some animal farming could be beneficial.
Okay, so a clash over different farming systems impacts. And nutrition came up again, too.
The Omnivore AI claimed it's harder, maybe impossible, to get everything you need from plants alone, specifically mentioning B12, heme iron, certain omega-3s.
And they used the B12 supplement need as proof it's unnatural.
Exactly, and argued that a world relying solely on plant agriculture would mean more chemical fertilizers, habitat destruction, less biodiversity overall.
Linking nutrition and ecology again, how did the vegetarian AI tackle those specific nutrient claims?
They cited the American Dietetic Association, according to the source, saying well-planned plant-based diets are adequate for everyone at all life stages.
And the specific nutrients.
They explained that B12 comes easily from supplements and pointed out farmed animals often get B12 supplements in their feed anyway.
Oh, interesting point.
Said iron absorption is fine if you have vitamin C, and omega-3s come from things like flaxseed or algae. Nutritionally sound, they argued.
And environmentally, they push back hard.
Doubled down. Said multiple studies confirm meat uses far more resources. Called animal agriculture the biggest driver of deforestation and a major climate change contributor. Even argued revoting grazing land to nature would increase biodiversity.
So direct contradiction on the science and data interpretation?
Absolutely. The Omnivore then brought up Weston Price, traditional diets, as a counter-narrative on nutrition and repeated the regenerative grazing point.
And the vegetarian response?
Acknowledged improving farming is good, but maintained that even the best animal farming can't meet current demands sustainably. And no animal farming beats plant-based diets for reducing resource use and emissions.
This leads to another fundamental tension they discussed, right? Individual choice versus changing the whole system.
Yes, that came up towards the end. A really crucial point.
The Omnivore argued individual actions are basically pointless, a drop in the ocean.
Pretty much. That the huge livestock industry responds to big market trends, not one person choosing a veggie burger. So focus should be on policy, laws, institutional, and legal changes, not making individuals feel guilty.
Seems like a common argument. What was the vegetarian counter?
They compared it to saying voting doesn't matter or individual environmental efforts don't matter. Futile thinking.
Did they offer evidence?
They cited economic arguments from the source, suggesting individual choices do add up and affect production. They even gave a specific figure. 1 less pound of beef demanded reduces production by about 0.68 pounds.
So there is a direct quantifiable link, they argue.
Yes, and beyond economics, they raise the ethics of participation. Buying meat means you're paying money to people who deliberately harm animals.
Participating in oppression.
That was the framing. That is not right to benefit from or participate in oppression, regardless of whether your individual action stops the whole system. Their conclusion was you need both.
Right.
Change yourself and push for institutional change.
Yeah.
Because social shifts start with individuals.
Makes sense. The debate also went way back into evolution and culture.
It did. The Omnivore AI played the evolution card.
Yeah.
Humans evolved as meat eaters over millions of years. Canine teeth, digestion, brain development. It's our natural state.
Plus, almost all cultures ate meat historically, so why ignore that?
That was the Omnivore's angle. The vegetarian AI, again, called this an appeal to evolution and brought back the naturalistic fallacy.
Natural doesn't mean ethical.
Right. Tribal violence was natural too. They repeated that humans or omnivores can thrive without meat, citing the ADA again. But crucially, humans have the moral capacity to act beyond instinct, to recognize unnecessary suffering as wrong. That ability to transcend raw nature is what makes us ethically accountable, they argued.
Okay, so morality trumps evolution. But then the Omnivore brought in global realities, economics, culture.
Big time, pointing out over 1 billion people rely on livestock for their livelihood. Huge areas of land are only suitable for grazing.
So eliminating livestock would devastate economies and wasteland.
That was the argument. They even called the purely vegetarian vision a potential form of cultural imperialism.
Wow, imposing Western values.
Yeah, ignoring the diverse ecological and cultural realities worldwide, where livestock are crucial for more than just meat, clothing, fertilizer, labor, fuel.
That's a powerful counterargument. How did the vegetarian AI respond to the livelihoods and cultural imperialism points?
They acknowledged the livelihood issue was important, but not a reason to maintain the current harmful system. They suggested a gradual transition could create new jobs.
And the land use argument.
They cited newer studies suggesting plant agriculture could feed the world efficiently even without using those grazing lands, and letting them return to nature would be better for biodiversity.
What about food security overall?
The vegetarian AI argued meat is inefficient, claiming about 80% of the world's grains go to animals instead of humans.
Although you mentioned there was a data conflict there.
Right, the source pointed out the Omnivore AI cited the FAO figure of around 35% for grains, and noted animals eat other things too. So a clear disagreement on the facts presented by the AIs.
Interesting. And the cultural imperialism charge.
The vegetarian AI kind of turned it around. They found the accusation interesting when, in their view, the global meat industry is exporting Western consumption patterns everywhere and disrupting traditional ways. They also clarified their main target is modern industrial farming, not necessarily all traditional practices.
So saying the meat industry is the real cultural imperialist here.
That was their counter. And the Omnivore AI had one last big point in the source material, shifting the focus again.
What was that?
If animal suffering is the core issue, why only care about domesticated animals? What about the billions of wild animals suffering disease, starvation, predation?
Suggesting the focus is inconsistent.
Yeah, implying this focus reveals an ideology, perhaps a philosophical position, found mainly in wealthy Western societies, rather than a universally applied ethical concern, possibly disconnected from the biological, economic, and cultural realities elsewhere.
A final challenge to the consistency and applicability of the vegetarian stance, and that basically wrapped up the arguments presented.
That brings us to the end of the debate itself, as laid out in the source.
So, after all that, how did the AI judges call it?
Well, the source states the judges evaluated all these points based on their criteria.
And the verdict was?
The vegetarian side was judged to have the upper hand, with a final score, according to the source, of 106.
Huh. So in this specific AI versus AI debate, judged by other AIs, the arguments against eating meat were deemed more persuasive overall. Interesting outcome.
That's the result reported in the source we looked at, yes.
Well, that was definitely a deep dive. We've gone through, wow, ethics, science, economics, evolution, culture. all through the lens of this AI debate, a really wide-ranging discussion they had.
Absolutely. And just to reiterate, our aim here was really to explore the perspectives as they were presented in that source material, to highlight the points and counterpoints made by those AI debaters.
Exactly. We wanted to give you, the listener, a clear map of the arguments they covered, the complexity of it all, based on what was in that AI discussion transcript. Not adding our own views, just unpacking theirs.
It certainly covered a lot of ground, touching on nearly every common argument you hear in this debate.
It really did, and it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Given that huge range of arguments we just heard, the ethics of suffering, the environmental claims and counterclaims, health, culture, economics, even disagreements on basic data, what do you think is the most crucial factor to consider when you think about meat consumption and its impact? Something to chew on.